okay. What we worried about is, yep, I tap it. It thinks it's been dead. Yes. Thank you. And wow, it is so wonderful to see how many people are here. And I'm glad I've gotten to meet some of you. I want to thank Auerbach for this amazing opportunity to be here. It's already been so rich. And I want to thank MESH. And for those of you back home, it is the Multidisciplinary Environmental Studies in the Humanities. And many people here are called meshmates. So Kate is a meshmate. But I also want to say hi. I've got some folks from Drew joining. I'm thrilled. And some other folks who I know from the field. And I think some of them are interested if it's recorded also. So I just want to say hi and thank you for joining us. And then I want to say, buckle your seatbelts, because I have way too much to share. And part of that is because a lot of folks I've talked to here already are sort of, this idea of religion and environmentalism is a sort of new idea. And for me, one of the reasons I'm at the, quote, forefront is just that I've been studying it since the 80s. So I know more than a lot of people, but there's so many wonderful folks coming up, and including the 3 editors of Grounding Religion. I met them all as graduate students, and now they're really leaders in the field. The other thing is, I just don't know how much you know about U.S. Christianity. It's an odd phenomenon, and I mentioned the word evangelicals, and then lots of question marks appear. So I'll try and spend a little time there. But here is the proposal that led to our collaboration. To examine initiatives that run counter to the tradition of Christian otherworldliness, whereby in which an earthly existence is discounted in favor of a heavenly beyond. At the same time, they turn away from a prevalent mode of worldliness within which the things of earth are construed as a mere means for human financial ends. And keep an eye on that. Namely as resources, ecosystem services, or a storehouse of natural capital. And so part of what our larger project is doing is, first of all, demonstrating all the other parts of the Christian tradition that aren't otherworldly. But most people know this sort of, my eyes are on heaven, this otherworldliness that especially leads Christians to perhaps discount things in this world. So that's what I'm going to start off with a little bit, and then just a little on forms of religious environmentalism. I'm remembering the title I sent in a long time ago, but also that's my research, so I'll give you that bigger picture. Then multi-species world making, and what exactly does that mean? For some of our research, because multi-species world making sounded a little too much for the folks that we were interviewing and hanging out with, we're using the language communities of creation. And I want to acknowledge that that comes from an indigenous Christian theologian, Randy Woodley. Is it pollinator gardens and native species? Is it food gardens on church grounds? What if the language of kinship, which is what we're hoping to hear some of, that really is a equal multi-species in some ways, what if that's missing? And so I have quite a few examples that have been forming our research, and we'll see, hopefully we'll get through them and maybe not just a photo collage. So this otherworldliness, how many of you know the historian of science, Lynn White, and the Lynn White thesis? That's what I thought. In religion and ecology circles, this is the name you almost have to have in your paper somewhere. And then someone comes along and says, I'm so sick and tired of hearing about Lynn White. But he was a historian of science, and in '67 wrote this very short article and said, we will continue to have a worsening ecologic crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man. Now, I won't go into it, but he came to this conclusion in part looking at the development of science and technology. He's a very good historian, and he's a Weberian, Max Weber. So he's very interested in this idea of sort of social conditions, material conditions, and ideal interests and how they interplayed. And that's, give me a glass of wine and I'll talk forever about Lynn White and Max Weber, so we can go on to that hour. But this is the quote that everyone hears: Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt. And you can imagine there are all sorts of people immediately said, no, that's wrong. And so in some ways, this article was a flashpoint for a burgeoning, but he wasn't completely right. Nor did he ever say he was completely right. He was just trying to name a dominant cultural stream. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time. This is Elizabeth Johnson, an incredible eco-feminist theologian. And she has a piece that says something similar, that part of the problem is that Christianity has sort of become too focused on humanity and God, this singular relationship. And that it's suspicious about the goodness of the world is coupled with concentration on the sinful human subject in need of divine mercy. So for those who aren't familiar, Christians, and notice I'm saying Christians, read the Hebrew scriptures of Genesis to say there was a fall. And that is not a Jewish interpretation of those early Genesis, but that there was a fall and all of nature is fallen, humans are fallen, and nature is sort of the realm in some variations of the devil, and where Christ was tempted in the wilderness. Not at all what the real translation of that we can talk about. It's not at all what we think wilderness is. But anyway, so that's part of what goes into this complex problem. So here's Johnson saying again that the Reformation's great solas, Christ alone, faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone, it was a very anthropocentric turn. So one of the things, and maybe some of you know the history of Christianity enough, is that people have gone back to many figures within Catholicism. And so here's the sort of highlighted quote, what I was referring to about the interpretation of Genesis. But nature becomes a backdrop, it becomes something to use, and I can go on and on about how it's inaccurate. But so here's just a brief gallop through history to say how many Christian theologians have thought very differently. This one is in Kate's book, and it's quotes from St. Basil and St. Gregory, who all talk about, you know, the treasures of creation. It's difficult to select what is most precious, the omission of which is the most severe, and sort of this talking about a choir of creation. Just a side note on that, that language of the choir of creation is very prominent now, with the idea that when a species goes extinct, a member of the choir is extinguished. So forms of Christianity that have huge praise choirs, they might be called. This is a particularly effective way to think about it. Here's,
could I also maybe just mention, Basil, of course, is the 4th century. So
I had that up there, didn't I?
Yeah, oh, did you? I'm not sure. Anyway, we're talking about one of the sort of founding fathers, as they're called, of Christianity. So this is not some kind of wacko. This is one of the great founding figures of Christianity, right? So
that's the whole point of this passage right now. So here's 4th century.
Yeah.
Now we're moving up to Augustine. And the whole idea of the book of nature, that God is revealed in all of the created order. Here's Aquinas, 13th century. God brought things into being in order that the divine goodness might be communicated to creatures and be represented by them. And here's an interesting thing. Because the divine goodness could not be adequately represented by one creature alone, God produced many and diverse creatures. This has real echoes in the Quran and Islam, this idea of the multitude, the diversity. And so thus the whole universe together participates in divine goodness more perfectly and represents it better than any single creature whatsoever. So now we'll get to the 16th century in Protestantism. And of course, I'm in Germany. I must quote Martin Luther. I will not quote Martin Luther in German. I would probably not do a good a job of it, and we would never get through this talk. But this often surprises many who think Protestantism has this notion of a fallen, corrupt nature, to know that Luther talked about God writes the gospel not in the Bible alone, but also on trees and in flowers. The power of God is essentially present in all places, even the tiniest leaf. Another place he talks about a grain of rice. And that Christ is present in all creatures. God is substantially present everywhere, in and through all creatures, in all their part and places, so that the world is full of God and God fills all, but without being encompassed and surrounded by it. Now that's a footnote. If you're ever wading around in the waters of Christianity, this note here is saying this is not pantheism. It is panentheism. And that becomes a very important distinction in some theological circles, that God is not sort of reduced to the world, even if present. But I'm not a theologian, and I probably should stop doing too much theology. But I teach at a Methodist seminary, and part of our research was over in England, so I always have to quote John Wesley. Now, Wesley is, I think, 18th century, and this one is one that always strikes my students, because what Wesley is saying is to not see the face of God in every creature is a kind of practical atheism. So for someone like me who was an evangelical at a crucial time when I was wanting to study science, and I was told that I needed to be careful that I wasn't worshiping the creation and seeing God too much in nature. And so, you know, I always wish my sort of 16-year-old self could have trotted out Wesley and said, no, you all that don't see it, you are the atheist, I'm the believer. But it is a very handy quote for Methodists. And here's another one that's so pertinent to some of our work, because if we're going to talk about multi-species world making, we've got to be talking about other animals. So this is sort of an extension of the Golden Rule. I believe in my heart that faith in Jesus Christ can and will lead us beyond an exclusive concern for the well-being of other human beings to the broader concern for the well-being of the birds in our backyards, the fish in our rivers, and every living creature on the face of the earth. Now, these are a few slides where I got creative and decided I had to move away from words on slides, but it's not going to last, so enjoy it while you see it. Here we are, back to a lot of words on a slide. This one, if anyone knows the sort of history of Christianity in the U.S., though it's not just the U.S., the social gospel movement, Walter Rauschenbusch was one of the figures of that. And what I often do with this quote is I put it up and I don't tell people when it's from. And I ask them to guess, and they always think it's something very contemporary, because they think that Christianity's interest in ecology is very contemporary. So you all can maybe read faster than I can talk, but I just highlighted a couple of parts of it in so much so that we remember with shame that in the past we took advantage of our greater power and used it with unlimited cruelty. So much so that the voice of the earth, which should have risen to you as a song, was turned into a moan of suffering. I highlight this because if you've read Laudato Si, Pope Francis, you're going to hear a very similar sort of framing. And so here he ends with the notion of returning to the Great Mother, who nourished us and our spirits enjoy perfect life in you. Notice he's not saying we're going to go to a heaven beyond that's not part of this world. So I think you've got the point now of my saying there is a lot of streams within Christianity that someone can draw on. This is Howard Thurman, who may not be known to you. He is an incredible African-American sort of nature mystical sort of, but he was Martin Luther King Jr.'s teacher, who introduced him in some ways to Gandhi. And he's quite really wonderful to read, so I always like to recommend. And here, again, some very comfortable saying, a universal kinship among all living beings. And now that I was sort of shown you that we can go right throughout history, we'll jump to much more contemporary voices. And of course, Pope Francis Laudato Si was a pretty big moment. It wasn't that all of that wasn't being done before. If you know Leonardo Boff's work and Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, that preceded it by 2 decades. But it was a document that weaves so much into it. I really recommend everyone reading it. And so you might remember that when we were reading Elizabeth Johnson, she talked about these 3 fundamental relationships that should be in Christianity. Not just the human to God and God to human relationship, but the human to the rest of creation, the other creatures, and those creatures, the creation, not just creatures, relationship to God. So that it should be a triangle. And so he's echoing this and how that's broken. He also echoes St. Francis' language of brother sun and sister moon. And by giving sort of voice to that, again, the idea that we see other parts of the created world that we are a part of as kin is pretty significant. It's not that he's the first, but that he's got a pretty big platform. I just threw in Sally McFaig, who is an ecofeminist who's very much influenced me. Remember, I'm a sociologist. I know I'm giving you all sorts of theologians, but we're going to veer away shortly. But anyway, just this idea of sort of trying to get Christians to see nature as valuable. And I love how she calls it supernatural Christians. So, many people would say that the U.S. environmental movement started with Lynn White, and I'm just going to give you a brief. It didn't. Joseph Sittler was saying quite a bit. He was a Lutheran, very much in conversation with Lutherans here in Europe. The World Council of Churches, the National Association of Evangelicals, many denominational statements. So as Earth Day is hitting the U.S. and in some ways other places, Christian denominations are responding and responding because there's already been lead-ups to it. So I am not going to read this. This is just sort of charting the significant moments in the 80s and the 90s. And I put this in because I was at a gathering of religious environmental leaders in Washington, particularly ones that lobbied the government. And everyone was sort of saying what they did, and I said I'd been studying, religious environmentalism since the 80s, and some wonderful, young, energetic person stood up and said, I thought it started in the 2000s. So I always want to put this slide in. It didn't. But in looking at the development of this, and I'm going to do my time check, I identified sort of 3 what I called streams, ethics, we might call discourse frames that were sort of prevalent, and they're quite different. There's Christian stewardship, which is more evangelical, more biblical. Eco-justice, which is much picking up on other justice issues and saying you can't fully consider any justice issue if you don't include the environment. Interestingly, eco-justice is not the same as environmental justice because it would still maintain that the rest of creation also needs justice, even apart from humans. And then what I called at the time creation spirituality, might be more likely to call it a sort of eco-spirituality now, that was much more interested in notions of the cosmic Christ, of sort of the evolution of the universe, and you'll see these different themes come back in. Now I would expand that theological spectrum in so many ways. Notice I didn't name ecofeminism there. I didn't name eco-womanism partly because they would participate in different strands, but it's quite complex now. But one of the things I had to do was say that that notion of Christian stewardship needed more nuance, because I did a lot of work following who were really anti-environmentalist evangelicals. Their main attack was on other evangelicals, and they took over the language of stewardship. We might call them wise use stewards, coming out of a portion of the U.S. environmental movement that was called wise use. And that is, we have to use things wisely, but they're here for us. And they're quite much the dominion sort of theology flavor and not the stewardship. And I won't go into the two different Genesis passages that go these different ways, but there is this distinction between dominion and stewardship within evangelicalism. And so I now would refer to those sort of evangelical, biblically oriented Christians as creation care, following their lead. They took to calling themselves creation caretakers in some ways, because they knew that this language of stewardship, as you will see, had become somewhat poisoned. But now you'll see I'm really a sociologist, and a sociologist who needs to pick up the pace. So I'm interested in frames, how people talk about things. And so that's partly what we're interested in. What is this emerging sort of portion of Christianity in its different forms that are trying to create communities of creation? And they might talk about them in different ways. So I'm not going to go into all these discursive frames, and I'm going to just check for a moment. The definition of evangelicals is highly debated. You could write a whole book on it and get it published yet one more time. But it's a pretty strong focus on the authority of the Bible. Not always literalism, but pretty close. That humans are sinful, they need to be saved, that salvation is through Jesus Christ, and that you need to lead others to Jesus to be saved. So those are sort of some common characteristics. And these are the kind of questions that when I've gone out over the years and talked with folks, I've heard back. Well, if the world is going to be destroyed, why be concerned with what might be the approach of the end time? So in other words, environmental degradation is what's predicted in this reading of Revelation. And I'll talk more in a class tomorrow about that. Caring for the earth seems very worldly or secular. It's not what Christians do. We care about human salvation. Since the earth is fallen and controlled by Satan, aren't we called by God to be set apart from the world? Or to conquer it? Remember, that's part of the sort of mastery of nature narrative, is if the world is sinful and fallen and chaotic, humans are put here to order it again. And if you know Faust, I hope many of you know, Goethe's Faust, that's exactly what's happening at the end there, the sort of ordering of nature. So this is always an interesting one. This is how we've always done it, and we consider ourselves good Christians. So are you saying we're bad Christians? Notice how that points to how you have to be very careful about how you ask questions. Because you're not saying you're a bad Christian. It's just, anyway. And so these are some of the other common ones. Loving nature means worshiping creation. It's environmentalism is a new age religion. You've heard me say some of these other ones. All this stuff is coming from denominational agencies, and they don't know what we deal with here on the ground, and it's just they're reading too many books. This one is a pretty big one. There are too many other more pressing concerns, like hunger, like poverty, that we should be about. And environmentalism is a white concern. It's about saving whales and polar bears and hugging trees, and it has nothing to do with me. And so you'll see some of our choices are of groups that would very much counter that. The science is uncertain. I still love that one. All you have to do is say, doesn't seem like the science agrees, and you've cast doubt, and you've pretty much won the battle. Because then you're put on the defense. Oh, no, the science really is real. And we know that talking about the science isn't going to necessarily change people's minds, at least in the United States. So, I'm already tired of talking about these folks, but just summing it up here, basically that nature has no intrinsic value because it has utilitarian value. It's that language we're using of the human resource. And part of the reason I'm starting to bring this out is human labor makes it a useful commodity. Natural resources are abundant and put there. I'll probably skip over a quote that sort of one of the leaders of the Cornwall Alliance says, God buried all that oil and coal in the ground. And it's an affront to God if we don't go and get those gifts and use them because they were buried for us. So it's very much environmentalism hurts the poor, hurts the economy. And since I know I'm getting shorter on time, I'm going to make my point early. And that is, this is from the group that we might call the most otherworldly, the most focused on saving souls and salvation. But notice how very worldly all of this concern is. Because these are folks that the health and wealth gospel is what, sort of God's blessings are more evident upon you the wealthier you are, the more money you make. And so that is a very prevalent sort of form of Christianity. And these folks feed right into it. Anything that would curb our amassing more wealth in some ways is therefore anti-Christian. It's because capitalism is Christian. That's just a little side note. I'm not going to go there. So they put out if you ever want just to spend a few moments going, I can't believe this is true, look at Resisting the Green Dragon, just even the promos. It's actually a 12-part series. The Green Dragon was actually named after the physicists Brian Swimme and Thomas Berry wrote a book. The universe is a green dragon, but they just can't stand what Harry Potter is doing and Avatar and all of these things. And so the dragon becomes the symbol of all this new age, paganism or whatever. And so we need dragon slayers. It's deadly to human prosperity, deadly to human life, deadly to human freedom, deadly to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And this is said in this voiceover with sort of dripping, fonts on the screen. Or that environmentalists want a one world government. That's why all these UN meetings. So I'm not going to read these, but it's still sort of on that same frame that any attention to animals having worth takes away from humans having worth. So materialism believes that humans are simply animals. Earth spirituality believes that all these things are divine, humans including. Each of us is a god or goddess. How do these eras define our relationship with Earth? And what's really interesting is the next line. How does each era lead to disordered sexuality? So you can find all these, intersecting concerns that if you're watching the U.S. election won't be. So if you want to find out more, I co-wrote I think a very good journal article on this in the United States and in Brazil with a Brazilian sociology PhD who came to work with me. And just fascinating, the sort of echoes and resonances. And this is one that he really called to my attention, is that wanting to set aside all these nature preserves around the globe is really making the people in it, the indigenous people, it's a zoo, and they're animals on display. And so that all of the efforts, for instance, the Amazon to preserve areas is really denying indigenous people their desire to develop as they want to and making them into human zoos. And so this it's really interesting to watch these tropes show up in various ways. And this is the one that I often introduce myself, just sort of for, disclosure. Apparently, I want, I think stewards should be entrusted to Shetland ponies and dung beetles. I want mass infanticide, zero population growth, reduced standards of living, and vegetarianism. And the core of environmentalism is they hate mankind. This gets people's attention. This was a very popular book. And then I asked them at the end of my talk to decide if I really feel up with it. The election is tomorrow. And so I geeked out a bit on all sorts of survey material that I am now going to just go straight through without pausing and say that the survey literature does not let one make an easy assumption about the relationship between environmental attitudes and theological beliefs. Because you can, some of them show, you can have black Protestants and white evangelicals who are about as opposite as you can get on care for the environment and climate change. They look incredibly alike on biblical literalism, on end times, sort of apocalypticism. So it's just not an easy correlation. And so it becomes very complex. And, if you've had 2 glasses of wine and want to look at some charts with me, we'll have fun. But having brought up Lynn White there in the beginning with all of the, nobody reads beyond that first article. So I always feel, I had a doctoral student do a whole dissertation, and I always feel duty-bound to sort of say that nobody realizes that what White was calling for was a democracy of all creatures. That's where he was pushing Christianity to go to. And so, since the churches remain, despite some competition, the chief forgers for hammering out values, this is important. I feel that before too long, they may find themselves going on to the third legitimately biblical position, the democracy of all God's creatures. So in some ways, we've been out there looking for other folks who might be part of that strand of Christianity, looking for. And so now, finally, I get to our research. That this is from a trip we made to London just less than a month ago, building on Kate's research that she'd already done in this book and long connections with really incredible church. But I wanted to draw your attention that this map is just of Wales and England. There are separate organizations for Scotland, for Ireland, but the idea that Arosha is giving out sort of levels designation. You can be bronze, silver, and gold, and they've got it all carefully mapped out. These are the 5 sort of categories that then churches apply to be recognized. And so it's a gold mine for a researcher, because you just go and, and then you look and it's like, is there anything on their website? Why would I know this? And what you'll see is our 2 gold churches that we looked at. One has it all over the website, and the other one, I can't find it. So, here's some part of what Arosha is doing in its different ways. Wild Christian is recognizing individuals, partnering up with folks, trying to protect vulnerable species. And I think it's important for people to know there are incredible organizations out there doing this work. Nobody has to reinvent the wheel. This, I think, was supposed to be earlier. This is just giving you a snapshot of the really exploding world of religion and animals and animal theology. And this is the companion volume that followed Eco-Spirit, Divine Animality, particularly looking at Derrida. But you can see one thing, if you're going to work on animals, you've got to have a colorful All of the non-colorful books I do not put in here. It's like they didn't get the message. You got to get people's attention. So I thought this might, you know, some big nice colors might be appreciated by now. And what I want to pause here and make a really important point is that a lot of Christian activists, theologians, want to say something like human and more than human, human and other kind, trying to diminish this great gap in human exceptionalism. But if you're a person who has been called an animal in various derogatory ways throughout your life, women perhaps, people who are disabled, people of color, being told that you're close to animals doesn't sound very good. And so this James Cone quote, he's considered the father of Black liberation theology, is from 2001. And so I always sort of put it out there because he's trying to get people to see the connections between fighting against racism and fighting against environmental deterioration and animals. And then this is Christopher Carter, who I can't recommend enough to read, meaning I recommend him a lot, pointing the same thing out, that part of what then happens is that most anti-racist activists hear the sort of dangers of being saying humans are animals, and they just sort of assert that people of color are humans too. And they never quite take on the fact that they are still reifying that animals are much lesser. There are some great people of color now, some feminists who come out of working on disability, all sorts of coming into this conversation to make it more nuanced. But I always like to make that. So I have, according to this, I'm going to steal 5. Well, someone said an hour.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. I'm going to take the hour to introduce you to some of the churches. This is St. John's Waterloo, right opposite Waterloo Station by Waterloo Bridge. If any of you have ever followed Extinction Rebellion and the particularly big protest in London, this church was ground zero for activists sleeping in the basement, you know, bringing in all sorts of props for closing off the bridge. A very committed pastor who sort of was challenged by a congregant and saw the light and has done a lot. But there is nothing on the website that I can find that says that. Now, interestingly, they have put tons of effort into a sort of biodiverse native species gardens, and you'll see it is gorgeous, and it is a real place of respite in the middle of very busy part of London. It's an important place for people who are homeless, for all sorts of different folks. But they decided that partly what they wanted to do was to create these gardens that were welcoming to all sorts of species. And so I'm just going to give you some pictures. These were late, you know, already in October, and it's still just gorgeous. They're, you know, that map and code, it probably has 100 different species listed on it. I didn't put up both parts of it. So these are just some views. They do have still a large area of grass because people like to come there and walk their dogs, and they decided that was important. But you can just see this is just a real little haven in the midst of a very busy part of London. And so they're very proud of this. They've gotten an Eco Church Gold Award. They certainly took environmental efficiency principles into the redesign, and they could finally redesign the church. And as I said, the pastor is quite known for being very active on climate issues particularly. But it's not on the church's website. So that I'm going to introduce you now to the second church. This is St. James Piccadilly. I always feel, I've learned, I should say, this is a Christopher Wren church, design church. So they're struggling with getting enough money to renovate. But here's their website. This is St. James's website, and what we do about us, Earth Justice, is very clear. And this is, I don't know if any of you all ever seen this symbol before. This is the pattern of the temperature rising, and it's an effective sort of graphic of that. St. James strives to advocate for earth justice and to develop deeper connections with nature, rooted in loving the world and all its inhabitants, human and other than human. The community seeks to act from a place of environmental interconnectedness in services, events, and activism. And in our interview, they were aware of exactly the problem of the other than human language and wrestling with it. They're very concerned with issues of racial justice, indigenous justice, sort of LGBTQ awareness. So they're a great example of recognizing the intertwining of all of these justice issues that the church is facing. They have done some incredible projects. One of them I wanted to bring up, and I think you write about Daily Bread, right? Was right before the shutdown for COVID. They had given out everybody wheat to grow. They wanted to focus on bread and how long this connects humanity's 10,000-year relationship with it. And so they had given out seeds for people to grow at home and to grow in the churchyard. And I think it was a week later, the church shut down. So everybody took to posting their pictures of what their wheat was doing. And it became a form of community to watch the wheat grow and thrive. And the lead pastor, who is very well known, Lucy Winkett, she took care of the wheat. And so you can see they have a beautiful video collage on their website of all the wheat. And when we interviewed them, they kept bringing it up. And there's also this is one page, the Rising page. One of the members of the eco team is a poet who wrote poems to go with all the different incredible creativity. The next project was Aftermath, sort of reflecting on the aftermath of COVID-19, but also this is what the church looked like after it had been bombed in World War II. And so I'm not going to spend tons of time, but they knew that 42 different kinds of, quote, weeds had grown up in the aftermath. And they decided to grow those weeds again, in part because many of them really aren't weeds. And so this was part of it. And with each of these projects, they have so much educational material and discussions. And, I can slap a bunch of pictures on one screen and it doesn't do it justice, because here are some other ones. Changing our minds, connecting to country, bringing in conversation with Australian elders, or changing our minds, and sort of they had indigenous scholars from North America and Australia. There's a strong Australia connection, which isn't surprising. It's an Anglican church. And I think one of the members, Deborah, is Australian. And then they have this very, well-known Australian eco-feminist scholar who's interested. And so this phrase here, the universe is a communion of subjects rather than a collection of objects, is the central commitment of the ecozoic. They have been inspired by that stream of creation spirituality I talked about so long ago. Very much connected in its beginnings with Matthew Fox, if anyone knows that name, probably not, but more so with a Catholic Passionist priest who calls himself a geologian and not a theologian, and named Thomas Berry. And his writings have been incredibly influential throughout a lot of this more creation spirituality, learned from the evolution of the universe, learned from, and I wish I could go into it, but just note.
I should just say Brian Swim is
Yes.
a physicist.
Is a physicist, right?
So,
and that was,
science.
they co-wrote a book, the first one called The Universe's Green Dragon.
Yeah.
And since then, now they've done the Journey of the Universe. If you look it up, you can watch a whole incredible film. So then, food for the ecozoic and growing millet, sort of, what are we going to be able to grow here as climate change warms up things, dries out things? But also, millet is becoming a much less grown crop in Africa, where it particularly thrives and it's incredibly nutritious. So there's a whole wonderful thing on that. And this is Deborah that we've been referring to, one of the real leaders, and some of the millet that she had brought to the harvest service that we went to. And then they did food for the ecozoic and did a Three Sisters planting of, it's usually corn. The corn provides a place for the beans to grow up, and then a squash plant, a pumpkin plant, covers the ground around it and keeps the moisture in. And this was some indigenous groups in the U.S. Used this pairing. But there's all sorts of other things that they were growing here. And just these, I just wanted to see this real creativity. These are pictures of their incredible garden. It's not as extensive, but again, it's really a place where people come by to have a lunch break from the office. It's really well used. And this group up here is gathering for this service that we attended. And it started out, they have a contemplative service every Sunday.
Every month.
Every month, thank you. See, I should say, and now to Kate, where they start out contemplating nature. This one we were instructed to find a tree or something in just pretty much 15 minutes of sort of focusing on that. And it was a really good turnout, in part because the service then started outdoors. And I don't know what happened to my pictures of that. Wonderful. I may have felt embarrassed to take pictures. But it was quite this lovely procession. Everybody proceeded into the church. This was the altar that awaited, the harvest altar. Kate and I, we were, quote, found out when we said we want to come and interview. They looked and said, you guys look like you could say something interesting as part of the sermon. And so we had a lovely, couple of minutes each. But the whole service was carefully crafted and really beautiful. And one of the things that was a delight in doing the interview with some of the lead priests is our interest in the church made them realize that they did have something special going there. But I think also this whole service was part of that realization. And they report they had incredible feedback from it. People came for the first time ever. So here is a church that's busy broadcasting to everybody. And now we switch to the U.S., where I have done less of the interviewing work. But my choices, there's so many. One of them was to find a Catholic example. And there is a movement, it's global, called the Green Sisters of various religious orders of women who have worked on bringing their properties into biodiverse. And it's really amazing and hard to choose. But I chose the Green Mountain Monastery because it's founded sort of on Thomas Berry's principles. And so this is some of the stuff from their website. Ecozoic means house of life and refers to the emerging era where we learn to live as mutually enhancing members of this single sacred community. Now maybe you have in the back of your mind still the language from Resisting the Green Dragon, just to give you a sense of this huge, huge spectrum. guided by fourfold wisdom, religion, women, indigenous, and science. Here's that quote again from Barry: Earth is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. It's a frequently used quote because it so well sums it up. When we are asked how many are in your community, we say innumerable. Too many to count. The birds, trees, plants, animals, insects, humans, stars constitute the totality. So they really are wanting to be provocative in getting people to think about who's in your community. I gave each one a full slide because they were just so beautiful. And I thought, by the end of a talk, give people something, you know, really nice to look at. But now we're going to go back to a few words before we end. The National Wildlife Federation in the United States has a Sacred Grounds project. And so like Eco-Church, there isn't anything like Eco-Church in the U.S. because so many denominations certify their congregations, and then there's these big organizations like Green Faith and Earth Ministry and Faith in Place that also certify sort of congregations in their area. So it's hard to find a wonderful map like that. But I was really interested in this National Wildlife Federation Sacred Grounds project because it's meant to help churches make their grounds more biodiverse. Churches tend in the U.S. have tons of property. It's a monoculture of grass. It's usually sprayed like crazy. It's never used except for the Easter egg hunt, maybe, the 4th of July picnic. So they've been doing some really interesting work. And I had to bring up Fred Sherlander-Dobb here. For one thing, he has just got the best smile I've ever met. He is a long time Jewish activist, key for decades now. But I liked what he said about the Sacred Grounds Project. It's a logical and appropriate idea because different faiths are united in their notion that God is creator, and we, as one of the creations, need to band together to protect creation for the glory of the Creator. So just the kind of language he's trying to use, I could not find that explicit language on any of the projects. But I chose one. It's in East Washington, D.C., and I chose it in part because Reverend Kip Banks also teaches at a seminary there. And it's easy for me to go visit. I'm about 4 hours away from D.C. But I was particularly wanting to focus on examples of Black churches and there's just a huge movement of Black environmental churches with various different, but they tend to be environmental justice oriented. So you can see that we have so many inequities: high poverty, high crime, a former power plant not far from us, runoff polluting. Whatever we can do to sustain God's creation, to pivot back to where God intended it to be, that creates justice. And here, well, we're going to just not, there we go. All the environmental catastrophes we see are doing harm to our brothers and sisters. And when I first read this, I'm like, okay. But I think it's actually our brothers and human sisters are animals and plants. And if we want healing to occur among our brothers and sisters, we have to heal the earth. But this is a really growing and important movement. It's creating a lot of work on community gardens in Black churches in food insecure areas, or like one of the leaders, Reverend Heber Brown III, would say, in food apartheid areas where there's just not access to healthy food. And here are just some pictures from their installation of a pollinator garden. But I want you to look, you can see how much grass there still is. Sort of my example of how much grass is around these churches and why something like the National Wildlife. This is the church I thought I was going to study, and I visited. And Trinity Church of Christ, for any of you who followed U.S. politics, this is the church that Obama went to. I don't think he still goes to, because I don't think he lives in Chicago anymore. It's 11,000 members. It is probably a one of the powerhouse Black liberation theology churches in the country. United Church of Christ has a long record on environmental justice, and so they're taking leadership on this is really important, and they do tons of stuff, but it's all through the environmental justice frame is what I decided. So they work on access to healthy food, they work on toxicity of surrounding water and land. Where they are in Chicago is very toxic. Pay a lot of attention to the location of recreation parks and gardens, Black farmers market, an urban garden, concerned with tree planting and tree resilience. Just don't put the trees in. The members of the congregation go and care and check up on them. And this is a green roof that they put on. There's solar panels, I'm told, somewhere. I just couldn't get a picture of them. But this gives you a sense of the kind of upgrade. This is a rain garden they put in. So a lot of care and concern, but nothing on the website. Again, I know all this from a doctoral student who did research, from hearing Moss preach. This information here is from the firm that did the renovation, not from the church. And this is why I was excited, because they're going to build this place called Imani Village, and it's a sustainable community with sort of the design between the apartments is lots of green space and ecological, energy efficient housing. And I had been told there was going to be a large farm in the middle of it. But when I went up there to interview them, that had become an indoor vertical garden. Because they said too many people came in and helped themselves, which they wanted, but in the process destroyed a lot of what was being grown. So the more I talked to the person designing this, and sort of the lead, she is not a green person. She's following Moss's lead, but it's really, again, on environmental justice, which is good principles. We need to have cleaner air here. People need to have green space around. They need to live in energy efficient. They need to live in new housing. So it's going to be pretty great. I have heard about it for a long time and got up there looking all around for it, and it isn't yet. But it's a lot to do. So this is some of the aspects of it. And now I really got to stop. And so I'm going to stop with the story I love that some of you have already heard. But part of the way I learned about Trinity UCC is a Chicago organization called Faith in Place. And I think this program exemplifies the challenges to a church in wanting to talk about multi-species world-making, communities of creation, because Faith in Place would have environmental organizations come all the time and want to get people on the south side of Chicago, which is predominantly lower socioeconomic status and predominantly people of color, to go on outings to plant, replant some of these areas with native species, and people were not interested. And Veronica realized, because they were particularly focused on monarch and bird migrations, that most of the people there had migrated. They had left home somewhere to come to what they hoped was a better place. And what do you want in a new place? You want familiar food. So she would get churches to have storytelling circles where the elders told their migration stories, and then she would tell the migration stories of the monarch and the birds. And now they cannot have enough. They never have enough native plants when they have an event. They have tons of people going on outings. That simple way of thinking about it a bit differently. So it is, how are you kin in a way to monarchs? How are our life experiences similar? But recognizing that sort of the narratives of well-meaning white environmentalism doesn't speak in a lot of communities. And that's an area I'm particularly interested in. Okay. Thank you for your patience.